Hello, everybody, and welcome back to my continuation of my book reading of Stephen King's Misery. And I'm in the last two chapters, 26 and 27, and I will do them in one sitting because chapter 27 is very short. So here we go. Chapter 26, Annie Everywhere. Annie had fallen on the main pile of burning paper. Her body had stopped its burning. Paul crawled towards his wheelchair. He had strained his back. There were blisters all over his right hand. His head ached, and his stomach rolled with the sick, sweet smell of burning flesh. But he was free. The dragon lady was dead, and he was free. He was halfway to his wheelchair when Annie opened her eyes. Paul watched in unbelieving while she got slowly to her knees. Perhaps she could not be killed. Her eyes were staring and horrible. A huge wound, pink red, showed through her hair on the left side of her head. Blood poured down her face. Annie cried through her throat full of paper. She began to crawl towards him. Paul turned away from her and started to crawl for the door. He could hear her behind him. She started across the broken glass, and then he felt her hand close around the stump of his left ankle. He screamed, "Dirt!" Annie cried. Paul looked round to see whether she had spat out the paper, but she hadn't, and her face was starting to turn purple. It was easy for him to pull his leg out of her grasp because there was no foot for her to hold on to. But she reached out again and seized him higher up the leg. Some broken glass stabbed into his elbow as he continued trying to crawl away. He turned again, and now her face was nearly black. He reached for the door frame and pulled hard on it to try to escape, but her hand closed on as tight. "No," he cried in fear and desperation. He felt her hand run like spiders up his back and reached his neck. He felt the weight of her body on his legs, spinning him to the floor. She moved further up to his body, trapping him. It was difficult for him to breathe. "Dirty bird, dirt!" The dragon lady on top of him. She seemed dark and immense. The air was driven out of her lungs as she fell on top of him, and her hands dug deep into his neck. He screamed, "Die! Can't you die? Can't you ever die?" Suddenly her hands were loose and she lay heavily on top of him. He pulled himself out from underneath her body and crawled into the hall. Annie lay silent and face down in blood and spilled champagne and pieces of green glass. Was she dead? She must be dead. Paul did not believe she was dead. He shut the door and reached up to turn the key in the lock. He lay down in pain and exhaustion on the floor. He stayed there only half conscious for an unknown period of time. He only moved eventually when he heard a scratching sound. At first he thought it was the rat in the cellar. Then Annie's thick blood-stained fingers crept under the door and tried to seize the end of his shirt. Paul screamed and punched at the fingers with his fists. The fingers did not disappear back under the door, but at least they lay still. Paul crawled further down the hall towards the bathroom. He was in terrible pain now, from his legs, his back, and his burned hand. As soon as he was inside, he found the packet of novel and swallowed 3 tablets. He sat with his back against the door and slept. When he woke up, it was dark. He listened carefully for any noises outside in the corridor. The more he listened, the more he seemed to hear slight noises. "This is crazy," he told himself. "She's dead." But what was that? Was that a light footstep in the hall? And she is in the locked room? She could have escaped through the window. Oh, she's dead. Paul had a problem. He needs to check on something. He wanted to make sure that the typescript was safe, the real typescript. What Annie had seen and tried to save was just a pile of blank pages and old unrecorded pages which he had collected. He had put the title page on top so that Annie would believe it was the book, but the real typescript was in his room, under the bed. He wanted it to be safe. He wanted people to read it. He knew it was the best book he had ever written. But that was the problem. Did he have the courage to go back into the room to get the typescript? Suppose Annie was still alive. He crawled slowly down the hall towards his room. In the shadows, he imagined Annie everywhere, waiting for him in the sitting room or further down the corridor. The boards on the floor made a noise behind him, and he turned around. Nothing this time. Outside, a car door shut, and he heard a man's voice say, "God, look at this, will you?" "And here!" he screamed. "And here! I'm in here!" It was the two policemen from the day before. When they managed to understand that Paul was saying, they looked in his room. Paul stayed in the corridor. They came out again, and the detective said, "There's no one there. There's a hell of a mess, blood and wine and stuff, and the window's broken, but there's no woman in here." Paul was still screaming when he fainted. They told him later that they found her in the barn. She was dead, but she was grasping the axe tightly in her hand and was on her way back towards the house. And that was the end of chapter 26. Last one is a very short 27, chapter 27, Misery's Return. Here we go. Paul's legs slowly recovered in hospital, and the doctors made him an excellent left foot. Misery's Return sold millions of copies, but Paul still sees Annie Wilkes waiting for him in corners, in shadows, on the street, and every woman who ever tells him that he is her favorite author. And that was my book reading of Stephen King's Misery. I really enjoyed it. Hope you guys also enjoyed it. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.